Tonight I've got a story for you called The 500 Hats of Bartholomew Cubbins. Now, there is a sequel to this book that I've already read, if you want to look that one up, and it's Bartholomew and the Oobleck. But this is kind of the original, I believe. But this one predates the other one, or at least how the story lines up. Well, this is kind of a fun one. This is not a rhyming book, but this is by Dr. Seuss. It's called The 500 Hats of Bartholomew Cubbins. And it's just as fun as any Seuss book, but it has more story than it does rhyme. So, in the beginning, Bartholomew Cubbins didn't have 500 hats. He only had one hat. It was an old one that had belonged to his father and his father's father before him. It was probably the oldest and plainest hat in the whole kingdom of Did, where Bartholomew Cubbins lived. But Bartholomew liked it, especially because of the feather that always pointed straight up in the air. In the kingdom of Did was ruled by King Derwin. His palace stood high on top of the mountain. From his balcony, he looked down over the houses of all of his subjects, first over the spires of the noblemen's castles, across the broad roofs of the rich men's mansions, and over the little houses of the townsfolk, to the huts of the farmers far off in the fields. It was a mighty view, and made King Derwin feel mighty important. Far off in the fields, at the edge of a cranberry bog, stood the hut of the Cubbins family. From the small door, Bartholomew looked across the huts of the farmers to the houses of the townsfolk, then to the rich men's mansions and the noblemen's castles, up to the great towering palace of the king. It was exactly the same view that King Derwin saw from his balcony, but Bartholomew saw it backwards. It was a mighty view, but it made Bartholomew Cubbins feel mighty small. Just after sunrise one Saturday morning, Bartholomew started for town. He felt very happy. Pleasant breeze whistled through the feather in his hat. In his right hand he carried a basket of cranberries to sell at the market. He was anxious to sell them quickly and bring the money back home to his parents. He walked faster and faster till he got to the gates of the town. The sound of silver trumpets rang through the air. Hoofbeats clattered on the cobbled streets. Clear the way! Make way for the king! All the people rushed for the sidewalks. They drove their carts right up over the cobblestones, over the curbstones. Bartholomew clutched his basket tighter. Around the corner dashed 50 trumpeters on yellow-robed horses. Behind them, on crimson-robed horses, came the king's own guards. "Hats off to the king!" shouted the captain of the king's own guards. On came the king's carriage, white and gold and purple. It rumbled like thunder through the narrow street. It swept past Bartholomew. Then suddenly its mighty brakes shrieked. It lurched, and then it stopped. The whole procession stood still. Bartholomew could hardly believe what he saw. Through the side window of the carriage, the king himself was staring straight back at him. Bartholomew began to tremble. "Back up!" the king commanded the royal coachman. The royal coachman shouted to the royal horses. The king's own guard shouted to the crimson-robed horses. The trumpeters shouted to their yellow-robed horses. Very slowly, the whole procession backed down the street until the king's carriage stopped right in front of Bartholomew. The king leaned from his carriage window and fixed his eyes directly on Bartholomew Cubbins. Well? He demanded. Bartholomew shook with fright. "I had to say something," he thought to himself, but he could think of nothing to say. "Well," demanded the king again, "do you or do you not take off your hat before your king?" "Yes, indeed, sire," answered Bartholomew, feeling great relief. "I do take off my hat before the king." "Then take it off this very instant," the king commanded the king more loudly than before. "But, sire, my hat is off." answered Bartholomew. "Such impudence!" shouted the king, shaking an angry finger. "How dare you stand there and tell me your hat is off?" "I don't like to say you're wrong, sire," said Bartholomew very politely, "but you see my hat is off," and he showed the king the hat in his hand. "If that's your hat in your hand," demanded the king, "what's that on your head?" "On my head?" gasped Bartholomew. There did seem to be something on his head. He reached up his hand and touched a hat. The face of Bartholomew Cubbins turned very red. "It's a hat, sire," he stammered, "but it can't be mine. Someone behind me must have put it on my head." "I don't care how it got there," said the king. "You take it off." And the king sat back in his carriage. Bartholomew quickly snatched off the hat. He stared at it in astonishment. It was exactly the same as his own hat. The same size, the same color, and it had exactly the same feather. "By the crown of my fathers!" roared the king, again leaning out the carriage window. "Did I or did I not command you to take off your hat?" "You did, sire. I took it off. I took it off twice." "Nonsense! There's still a hat upon your head." "Another hat?" Again Bartholomew reached up his hand and touched the hat. Come, what's the meaning of all this?" demanded the king, his face purple with rage. "I don't know, sire," answered Bartholomew. "It never happened to me before." The king was now shaken with such fury that the carriage rocked on its wheels, and the royal coachman could hardly sit in his seat. "Arrest this impudent trickster!" shouted the king to the captain of the king's own guard. "We'll teach him to take off his hat." The royal coachman cracked his long whip. The king's carriage swung forward up the street toward the palace, but the captain of the king's own guard leaned down from his big brass saddle and grabbed Bartholomew Cubbins by his shirt. Away flew Bartholomew's basket. The cranberries bounced over the cobblestones and rolled into the gutter. With a jangling of spurs and clatter of horseshoes, the captain and Bartholomew sped up the winding street toward the palace. Out of the narrow streets, up the hill, Bartholomew clung to the captain's broad back. On and on they galloped, past the bright gardens of the wealthy merchants, higher and higher up the mountain, on past the walls of the noblemen's castles. Flip! The sharp wind whisked off Bartholomew's hat. Flip! Flip! Two more flew off. Flip! 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 Flew another and another. 4, 5, 6, 7. Bartholomew kept counting as the hats came off, faster and faster. Lords and ladies stared from the windows of their turrets, wondering what the strange stream of hats could mean. Over the palace drawbridge they sped, through the great gates and into the courtyard. The captain pulled in his reins. "His Majesty waits in the throne room," said the guard, saluting the captain. "The throne room!" The captain dropped Bartholomew to the ground. "I certainly hate to be in your shoes," he said, shaking his head sadly. For a moment Bartholomew was terribly frightened. "Still," he thought to himself, "the king can do nothing dreadful to me, because I really haven't done anything wrong. It would be cowardly to feel afraid. Bartholomew threw back his shoulders and marched straight ahead into the palace. "Follow the black carpet," said the guard at the door, and through the long hallway Bartholomew could hear the muttering of voices behind heavy doors. "He won't take off his hat? No, he won't take off his hat." Bartholomew walked on till he stood in the very middle of the throne room. The king, in his long scarlet robe, was sitting on his throne. Beside him, Sir Alaric, keeper of the king's records, stood Sir Alaric, the keeper of the king's records. He wore in his belt, instead of a sword, a long silver ruler. Lords and noblemen of the court stood solemn and silent. The king looked down at Bartholomew severely. "Young man, I'll give you one more chance. Will you take off your hat for your king?" "Your Majesty," said Bartholomew as politely as he could, "I will, but I'm afraid it won't do any good." and he took off his hat. And it didn't do any good. Another sat on Bartholomew's head. He took off hat after hat after hat after hat, until he was standing in the middle of a great pile of hats. The lords and noblemen were so astonished that they couldn't even speak. Such a thing had never happened in the throne room before. "Heavens! Heavens!" said Sir Alaric, keeper of the king's records, blinking behind his triangular spectacles. "He's taken off 45. "And there were 3 more down in the town," said the king. And you must add on the 87 more that flew off my head as we galloped up the hill," said Bartholomew, trying to be helpful. 135 hats, most unusual," said Alaric, writing it down on a long scroll. "Come, come," said the king impatiently. "Sir Alaric, what do you make of all this nonsense?" "Very serious nonsense, your majesty," answered Sir Alaric. "I'd advise you to call in an expert on hats." "Excellent," agreed the king. "Ho, guard! Fetch in Sir Snips, maker of hats for all the fine lords." Into the throne room marched the smallest man, wearing the tallest hat that Bartholomew had ever seen. It was Sir Snips. Instead of a sword, he wore at his side a large pair of scissors. "Take a look at this boy's hat," commanded the king. Sir Snips looked at Bartholomew Cubbins' hat and sniffed in disgust. Then he turned to the king and bowed stiffly. "Your Majesty, I, Sir Snips, am maker of the hats for all the fine lords. I make hats of cloth of gold, fine silks and gems and ostrich plumes. You ask me what I think of this hat? Pooh! It is the most ordinary hat that I have ever set eyes on." "In that case," said the king, "it should be very simple for you to take it off." "Simple indeed," mumbled Sir Snips haughtily, and standing on his tiptoes, he pushed his pudgy thumb at Bartholomew's hat and knocked it to the floor. Immediately, another appeared on Bartholomew's head. "Screebies!" screamed Sir Snips, leaping high in the air, higher than he was tall. He turned and ran, shrieking, out of the throne room. "Dear me," said the king, looking very puzzled. "If Snips can't do it, this must be more than an ordinary hat." 136, wrote Sir Alaric, wrinkling his brow. "Your Majesty, I advise you to call in your wise men." "A fine idea," said the king. "Ho, guard! Bring me Nad. Nad knows about everything in my kingdom." In came an old man. He looked at the hat on Bartholomew's head, and he looked at the pile of hats on the floor. "Nad, my wise men, can you take off his hat?" asked the king. Nad shook his head solemnly. Solemnly, no. "Then fetch me the father of Nad," commanded the king. "He knows about everything in my kingdom and all the world beyond." In came an even older man. When he looked at Bartholomew, he looked at Bartholomew's hat, the father of Nad merely locked his fingers across his beard and said nothing. There's Nad. There's the father of Nad. "Then bring me the father of Nad. He knows everything about my kingdom, everything in my kingdom and the world beyond, and in other worlds that may happen to be." Then came the oldest man of them all. But he just looked at Bartholomew and nibbled nervously at the end of his beard. "Does this mean there is no one in my whole kingdom who can take off this boy's hat?" bellowed the king in a terrifying voice. A small voice came up through the balcony window. "What's the matter, Uncle Derwin?" To Bartholomew, it sounded like the voice of a boy. The king stepped out on the balcony and leaned over the marble railing. "There's a boy in here just about your age," the king said. "He won't take off his hat." Bartholomew tiptoed up behind the king and looked down. There stood a boy with a big lace collar. A very proud little boy with his nose in the air. It was the Grand Duke Wilfrid, nephew of the king. "You send him down here," said Grand Duke Wilfrid. "I'll fix him." The king thought for a minute. He pushed back his crown and scratched his head. "Well, maybe you can. There's no harm trying." "Take him to the Grand Duke Wilfrid," commanded the king, and two of the king's own guards led Bartholomew out of the throne room. "Pooh," said the Grand Duke Wilfrid, looking at Bartholomew's hat and laughing meanly. "That hat won't come off? You stand over there." He pointed to a corner where the wall curved out. "I need a little target practice with my bow and arrow." Then Bartholomew saw the Grand Duke Wilfrid had only a child's bow. He didn't feel frightened. He spoke up proudly. "I can shoot with my father's big bow." "My bow's plenty big enough for shooting hats, especially hats like yours," answered Wilfrid, and he let an arrow fly. Zoom! It grazed Bartholomew's forehead and nipped off his hat. Away it blew, and over the parapet, another hat appeared on his head. Zoom! 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 The arrows flew till Grand Duke's whole bag full of arrows was gone, and still a hat sat upon Bartholomew's head. "It's not fair!" cried the Grand Duke Wilfrid. "It's not fair!" He threw down his bow and stamped upon it. 144 hats, gulped Sir Alaric. "These hats are driving me mad!" The king's voice rang out through all the palace. "Why waste time with a child's bow and arrow? Fetch me the mightiest bow and arrow in all my realm. Fetch me the yeoman of bowmen." "Yeoman of bowmen!" echoed the lords and noblemen of the court. A gigantic man strode across the terrace. His bow was as big as the branch of a tree, and the arrow was twice as long as Bartholomew and thicker than his wrist. "Yeoman of bowmen," said the king, "shoot off this boy's hat and make it stay off." Bartholomew was trembling so hard he could scarcely stand straight. The yeoman bent back his mighty bow. Gzoom! Like a mad giant hornet, the arrow tore through the air and toward Bartholomew Cubbins. Grzap! The sharp arrow had bit through his hat and carried it off and on for a full half-mile. Gzop! It plunked to a stop in the heart of an oak tree. There, on Bartholomew's head sat another hat. The face of the yeoman of bowmen went white as the palace walls. "It's black magic!" he shrieked. "Black magic, yes, that's just what it is," the king sighed with relief. "I should have thought of that before. That makes things simple. Back to the throne room. Call my magicians." In the whole throne room there wasn't a sound as loud as a breath, but from the spiral stairs that led down to the southwest tower came a shuffling of slow, padded feet. The magicians were coming. Low and slow they were chanting words that were strange. "Dig a hole 5 furlongs deep, down to where the night snakes creep. Mix and mold the mystic mud, Malber, balber, titter, tud." In came 7 black-gowned magicians, and beside each one stalked a lean black cat. They circled around Bartholomew, Cubbins muttering deep and mysterious sounds. "Stop this useless muttering," ordered the king. "I want a chant that will charm away this boy's hat." The magicians huddled over Bartholomew and chanted, "Winkabis, tinkabis, faudici, clay. Hat on this demon's head, fly far away. Howl, men, howl away, howl away, howl away. Yowl, cats, yowl away, yowl away, yowl away. Hat on this demon's head, seep away, creep away, leap away, gleep away, never come back." "Mighty good chant," said the king, looking very pleased. "Are you sure it will work?" All the magicians nodded together. "But," the king looked puzzled, "there seems to be a hat upon his head." There still seems to be a hat upon his head. How long will it take for the charm to work?" "Be calm, O sire, and have no fears," chanted the magicians. "Our charm will work in 10 short years." "10 years?" gasped the king. "Away, fools!" he shouted. "Oh, out of my sight! I can't wait 10 years to get rid of his hat. Oh dear, what can I do? What can I do?" If I were king," whispered the Grand Duke Wilfred, "I'd chop off his head." "A dreadful thought," the king said, biting his lip, "but I'm afraid I'll have to. Young man," he said to Bartholomew Cubbins as he pointed to a small door at the end of the room, "march down those steps and to the dungeon and tell the executioner to chop off your head." Bartholomew's heart sank into his boots, but he did as the king commanded. "I must take off my hat," he said to himself as he started down the long black stairway. "This is my last chance." One hat after another tore from his head. 156, 157, 158. It grew colder and damper. 217, 218, 219. Down, down, down. 231, 232, 233. It seemed to Bartholomew it must be the very heart of the mountain. "Who's there?" said a voice from the blackness. Bartholomew turned a corner and stepped into the dungeon. The executioner was whistling and swinging his axe wildly, because at the moment he had nothing to do. In spite of his business, he really seemed to be a very pleasant man. "The king says you must chop off my head," said Bartholomew. I'd hate to," said the executioner, looking at him with a friendly smile. "You seem like such a nice boy." "Well, the king says you have to," said Bartholomew, "so please get it over with." "All right," said the executioner, "but first you've got to take off your hat." "Why?" asked Bartholomew. "I don't know," said the executioner, "but it's one of the rules. Can't execute anyone with his hat on." "All right," said Bartholomew, "you take it off for me." The executioner leaned across the chopping block and flipped off Bartholomew's hat. "What's this?" he gasped, blinking through the holes in his mask. As another hat sat on Bartholomew's head, he flipped this one off, then another, and another.